So we have Bill DeMarco joining us. Bill, you are a retired Air Force officer and a retired Air Force pilot, or do we say aviator too? You've spent a career asking questions about a lot of the things that we talk about, and you came on our radar screen in a conversation around the golden mean and sacred geometry and the application of that concept in a treatise of two Chinese officers that was written decades ago called Unrestricted Warfare, that we've talked a lot about the grand plan of China versus the United States in the years to come, which is likely not going to be a naval showdown in the South China Sea, as we've talked about on other episodes. More asymmetric, more nonlinear, more the type of things that we talk about with John Boyd and complexity and the Kinevin framework and things like that. How did you, let's start there. So you're a strategist, you're a teacher. How did you come across that, specifically gravitating towards chapter 6 of that around the golden ratio? What really jumped off the page for you? And then we're going to riff off that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, first of all, guys, thanks for having me on. Mark, you reached out on LinkedIn, then I kind of went and looked at all the stuff you guys have going on, and it's amazing. So one of the things that I'm always looking at is how do I learn more? So just going into your website, looking at things you guys are up to, it's really, really impressive. So thanks for reaching out, Mark, and thanks for this opportunity. For me, and that idea of learning more, so I went to SAS, the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, here at Air University many, many moons ago. And one of the first books we had to read was Unrestricted Warfare. And of course, that book came out in 1999. But I keep thinking from a historical point of view, how many times do we look back at situations and go, the information was all there? I mean, just something as simple as, if you look at the version of Unrestricted Warfare I have, it's got the Twin Towers burning on the cover. So I think it was like the first or second edition of the book. Now there's a new cover. I look at like that, just the 9/11, we look at the reports after, the information was all there. We just failed to piece it together. So when we think about China, or as a Gen Xer, we looked at the Soviet Union, there were so many things that were written that nobody read. In Kampf, if you go back to World War II, I mean, it's like stuff is all out there. So I thought I need to pick up Unrestricted Warfare and give another read. And that was maybe 12, 18 months ago. But I read it and I was just like, oh my word. It's all right there. Everything, even though it was written 25, 26 years ago, everything that we see going on right now, whether it's the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, economics, cyber, you name it. And think where we're at with cyber back in 1999 and think where we're at now, worlds apart. Yet it's all there. So that was kind of why I picked it up. I just figured looking at that book, and of course we all know that was released by the state, right? The state approved that book to be released. So then you have to start wondering, well, what did the state want us to know? They clearly want us to know that. I'll pause there. I'll go on forever.
No, it's interesting. When you talk about books like that, I remember as a young officer, I was a first lieutenant, and one of my second lieutenants came up to me to complain that one of the Marines was reading Mein Kampf. And I said, well, it's actually on the commandant's reading list. And the reason that was on the reading list was to try to understand how the mindset and the frame of reference and the thinking that led up to the invasion of Poland, or the rise of National Socialism and things like that. And he was shocked. And then I also said, by the way, Guerrilla Warfare by Mao Zedong is also on the commandant's reading list. And there's very clear reasons that we're encouraged to read these things, and that's to broaden our scope and to broaden our perspective as warfighters. And we translate now the work that Ponch and I do that you're familiar with. We translate the warfighting ideals to business and sports and other areas. But taking the same concepts, it's very important to read as many perspectives as possible, even things that would seem on the surface unseemly, because it gives us a frame of reference and understanding of how circumstances unfolded and how things interacted, such that as we become better at sense making in our own environments, we're able to identify patterns faster. So like if you had read Mein Kampf, or if you read Guerrilla Warfare by Mao Zedong, when you see things emerging that match those patterns, you're able to do something about it faster than if you had. And unfortunately, a lot of that is lost in, I think, the modern military. People, one, they're not reading, and two, they're focusing on tech. They're not focusing on thinking. They're not focusing on the cognitive software that shapes and scans and it comes up with decisions, actions, and the learning capability.
Hey, Moose, I want to bring up something. Bill brought up that Unrestricted Warfare was released by the state. And that
Mm.
may be a misdirect, it may be a probe, it may be to create some type of mismatch. I want to point out something that Air University released, and that is this book here, right? The Discourse on Winning and Losing.
Yeah.
Okay, this is out there, but nobody reads it. Very few people understand it, right? So, Bill, back to you on this. Is it possible that the Unrestricted Warfare document that's been around since 1999, there you go, love it,
Love it.
that's been around since 1999 is not, it could be a misdirect, it could be a mismatch, it could be out there just to throw us off, or in fact, it could be a sound document that very few Chinese leaders understand and even fewer American military thinkers understand.
No, Ponch, I think that's a really good point. When I said released by the state, I don't mean as a misdirect. I mean, they released it for a reason. And I think it might have been more of the idea of, hey, this is what we're thinking. And think about when it came out, it was kind of it was a new way of looking at warfare, maybe, but it wasn't as, I don't want to say mainstream, that's the wrong word. But the way we look at it now is like, we're like, yeah, of course, you've got all these different asymmetric ways of attacking an enemy. It's not all going to be like you said. It won't be probably fought in the Straits of Taiwan. I don't believe, like in the Air Force, we talk a lot about this idea of the dogfight. I think the dogfight could come back, but I don't think it's going to be a massive dogfight, in the channel there or in the Straits. It's going to be much more nuanced. It's going to be more asymmetric. All the things that we know, that Boyd talks about. So, I didn't mean that in terms of it's a misdirect. I kind of meant it in terms of it's something that the Chinese probably want us to know. Interesting, too, you brought up this idea of not reading. Since I teach at the Staff College and the War College, I should say this because our students that take our courses, it's kind of an elective. We do a research task force on innovation. So the students pick this course. And so I don't see a lack of reading in that course, but I know there's a lack of reading when you go into the core courses. And I've had this conversation with several majors over, well, why do I need to read? And there's sometimes you have to read and reread. So I look at Unrestricted Warfare. Now I'm that geek that I bought the audio because I already had the book. So then I have the book and the audio because I want to be sure, am I really hearing or reading everything that's in the text? And you get something different when you listen to it, versus when you read it. So I've done both of those with Unrestricted Warfare, trying to understand the nuances of Chinese culture, because that's really what we mirror image ourselves on the Chinese or the Russians, and it's not the case. I was in a briefing with a general, it's been a couple of years back, but they were talking about something along the lines that there's no main highway or freeway between Moscow and like St. Petersburg or something like that. And they were saying, well, that shows you how backwards Russia is. Why wouldn't they have a main road there? And this general said, you're mirror imaging. They're Russians. They don't need a freeway because they're Russians. It's like the idea is we're saying you should have a freeway that shows that that you have achieved a certain level of infrastructure. And maybe in Russia, it's like, well, we don't need an American freeway. We're Russians. We just go.
Yeah, we're not really good at cultural alignment. And it's funny, other books that have been on service sheets reading lists, like 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. We have somebody forthcoming that we're going to be talking with next week that recommends reading books that Boyd talked about, like Andrew Krepetovich's The Army in Vietnam and others. And one of the things that Bing West, The Village is another great one. Disconnection from culture is a huge problem that we have, that we go around thinking everything is like us. General Stan McChrystal talks about this in Team of Teams, that we're running around Iraq with JSOC looking for a group of people that have a CO, XO, S1, S2, S3, S4. And then we realize they don't have any of that stuff. And they don't have any of that stuff for a reason, because if they had that stuff, we'd pulverize them, and they wouldn't, they would come at us our way. I find that the unrestricted warfare thing is not only important to read, it is scary that a lot of people don't know about it. One thing I would add too, in Science, Strategy, and War by Franzo Singa, he read that. He cites it as a source. In fact, he dedicates a good section of the last chapter to asymmetric warfare, the things that the Chinese officers were talking about in that book. And the last thing I would say was that we had G.I. Wilson on the show before. That was an acolyte and a collaborator of Boyd within the Marine Corps from 1979 till Boyd's death in 97. And the same thing, he said that not only had those officers that wrote Unrestricted Warfare, they've likely read the discourse book that both you and Ponch have held up. They read Boyd, but they also read the book, the article rather, that he co-authored with Bill Lind, Mike Wiley, and I forget the name of the Army officer, called The Changing Face of War, which was released in October of 1989 a month before something that they predicted basically happened. The Berlin Wall coming down that nobody expected. And these guys were talking about these patterns. And I don't think the tone of Unrestricted Warfare is doing anything other than trying to dial us in and attune us to the patterns that Boyd talked about, Sun Tzu talked about.
Moose, but it's going to be the patterns that we're not oriented to, right? That we need to pay attention to. Those weak signals that are out there that people like Bill are pointing out. So that orientation within the OODA loop is we can't project our orientation onto other cultures, onto other people. You and I don't have the same orientation, right? And that's what the OODA loop is telling us. It's an active process. Bill, I've read books. I've gone to Air University. I've got, ACSC years ago. I get your point about people not reading. We've had many folks on the show, several that talk about flow systems and physics of flow. And in their books, they have sections on the golden section, the golden mean, the golden ratio that I ignored. I just passed over. I'm like, whatever, this is some nonsense that somebody's talking about. Reading Unrestricted Warfare years ago, I didn't pay attention to chapter 6. I was like, what the hell is this? Some nonsense. So again, Mark and I say this quite often. We hear it in the complex adaptive system world, and that is in neuroscience world, is we only see what we expect to see, right? We have the idea that seeing is believing and believing is seeing, that type of thing too. So I want to start there with what is the golden section, golden mean, where we find it in nature, that type of thing. So how did you get attracted to chapter 6 based off of the golden section?
I'd love to tell you, I just came across it and it was boom. And I was like, check it out. Somebody told me about it and I don't remember who. I wish I did, but it's one of those that it was in a conversation, I think, when somebody mentioned, or it might have been another podcast, but somebody had mentioned chapter 6 and the golden mean. And I thought, man, I need to go back and look at that. So I picked it up, went back and looked, and yeah, it's so interesting to see that this idea of this mean is everywhere. And it's like, we find it aesthetically pleasing almost to go and seek this mean out. Now, of course, when we apply it to strategy, I don't think it's as maybe obvious or as potent as, like, let's say you look at in Athens, you look at the up on the hill, what do they call it? The apocalypse, not the apocalypse. Yeah, that's it. The
Acropolis.
The Acropolis.
Yeah, the Parthenon on the
Parthenon.
Acropolis.
Yes, exactly. The pillars, all those things are designed along the lines of the golden mean. So if you think about that, you think about a spiral shape of a shell, the golden mean is everywhere in nature. It's everywhere in architecture. It's a lot of places in art. Where is it in strategy? So if you can measure the columns in Greece and see that, oh, okay, yeah, I see the mean is right here. I don't think you can measure it in strategy, if that makes any sense. But you can see it because maybe we default to it and we don't know we're defaulting to it.
Let's hammer down on that though. We can't measure it by way of maybe objective metrics, but it doesn't mean that it's not still occurring. It doesn't mean that it's not still present.
I think we desire to measure things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like back to even what Ponch was kind of saying.
I get that. I guess what I'm saying is that in spite of our desire to measure things, it still appears that any universal phenomena, be it human action or otherwise, keeps presenting this ratio continuously. We talk a lot about how it appears in markets. Why would we think that geopolitical intercourse between nations would be any different? Why would we think that strategy would be any different? These are still humans. Humans are part of the ecology. They're part of the cosmos. Why would they not be acting in accordance with the way the universe is designed? We don't have to go too far into that.
I agree. I just think that's the thing, though. It's like somebody say, like, in this piece that I was playing with, which was totally just riffing off this chapter of trying to find out where do we see this ratio? And I kind of played with this idea of fortifications and defensive positions, the idea of maybe military formations and tactics. You think about this idea of infantry and cavalry, the idea of do you see more? Obviously, you have more infantry than cavalry. Did that mean, was it there in battles with Alexander the Great? I think the answer is yeah, but I don't know if Alexander measured it intentionally.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like equilibrium. You don't know that you're in it, but it still happens.
What if we can go back to the air war in Iraq and, those first days and look at the proportion of something? I'm sure there's something there. And the reason I bring that up is
Iraq 1 or 2?
One, more than likely. Go for it.
Yeah.
So my time in an Air and Space Operations Center, thinking about it with how we're allocating weapons on platforms and things like that, it's based off the threat. So the context is driving the way we behave, right? And that's changed in the last 20 years. We're not going to see that type of warfare, or at least I don't think we are, today. So, and I struggle with the application of, just, I'll call it sacred geometry for now, to strategy, because we just don't know how to do it. But I believe it's there, right? I just don't know, like you and Mark, I don't know how to measure it. And then the path that we've gone on in the last few years is we've looked at the golden ratio inside the pyramids. We've seen it in the Vitruvian Man from Leonardo da Vinci. We're learning more about squaring the circle. We've discovered that President Lincoln sat in his office for a couple of days trying to square the circle, which is matching the area of the circle to the area of the square using nothing more than a compass and a straight edge. We're learning about harmonics in the application to understanding markets. Music, why is music appealing to us? Why do we see patterns? And then a connection to the free energy principle. We're trying to minimize the energy we spend in connecting with the world. And that's probably why these things are the way they are, why beauty is the way it is. And, because that helps us minimize surprise, reduce the energy we spend on things. So when you think about strategy, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to minimize the energy you spend on influencing your opponent? And again, I'm throwing this out there because I struggle with how do we apply this to strategy, but I do believe it's there.
Yes. So that's exactly that's what I'm getting at is that we look at this and we're like, well, show it to me. And I don't know that I can, maybe I could. Another thing, when we talk about math, it's like, I'm so not a math guy. So that's the other problem too. If I had a mathematician, maybe we could pull these things apart. That's an interesting scenario of Desert Storm. Because I do think, I wonder if there's something there. You think about the opening night, of just taking down the IADs using soft on the ground, Apaches, and then stealth fighters. Could you play that out, with something along the lines of the ratio of the idea of the man on the ground or the small team on the ground? I think it was 2 Apaches and a few stealth fighters, and then you go through the hole with all the bombers. So there's your bulk. There's the 1.68 or whatever you want to say. That's the bulk of it. But maybe those lines are actually smaller as you look to the opening of that door with the force coming.
Well, we talk about too in the article, though, it's not a rigid formula. It's not rigid. Yet it doesn't mean, like we were saying, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah, so that's why I find it fascinating, because I'm very attracted, like Ponch, you mentioned art, music, and again, not an expert in any of those things. In fact, music it's a passion of mine, but I played an instrument many, many years ago. I played guitar and I was terrible, and I was in a couple of bands that I just leaned on the talent in the band and kind of hid in the background, if you know what I mean. In other words, enjoyed the experience, but I was not the person that added much to the team. But it was fun.
I'm wearing my Tool shirt today because they're a band that actually understands sacred geometry, and they use it quite a bit in their music. So kind of like you, I grew up around music. I understood the way they train music when you're younger and all that. I never came across the math. At least I don't remember coming across the math and the geometry inside of music. It wasn't until a few years ago when one of our colleagues pointed out to us, from his type of work he's doing on Wall Street. And then I shared with my daughter, there's Euclidean geometry, and there's this new type of geometry out there that it's kind of three-dimensional and all kinds of stuff. Then you get into the fascination between, what's going on with the pyramids. Why are people like Aaron Rodgers going to the pyramids to go experience something at another level? So you're starting to see this come into, I'll call it mainstream. It's on, you can find it on the web. You can find it on different specials on Netflix and wherever, in Gaia, wherever you want to look. But why aren't military leaders thinking like this? What are your challenges with communicating what's in this document with leaders?
I really think we're looking for back to the measurement, show me that 2 and 2 is 4. Show me that this makes sense. We invite, you guys might have heard of CASI, the Chinese Air and Space Institute. It's an air university thing, but it really is part of NDU also. So Brandon Mulvaney is the lead. And so we asked Dr. Mulvaney to come out every year to speak to our class. And one of the things that he says every year that I think some of the students get it and some of them don't. But we look at China and we want to say there's good and there's bad. You know what I mean? In other words, we do this and it's good. They do that and it's bad. And he'll say, it's not good or bad. It's different. And I think sometimes it's that space that we want to say 2 and 2 is 4. So like the golden ratio, when you read about this, you go, well, that should be easy then, right? If it's a mathematical equation, I can solve for X. I don't know that you can solve for X. It's more of a, Mark, you said it's fluid, right? It's not necessarily there. Like you listen to a song, the math might say this is a great song, but you hear it and you're like, Ooh,
This is
I don't know.
terrible.
There's something off. It's not
I
quite
had a
right.
conversation. Okay, so we're Gen Xers, right? You know what song from the 80s that I absolutely abhor? I hate, and everybody loves except me. White Snake, Here I Go Again on My Own. Absolutely hate that song. And I actually do believe it is something with the frequency or the impulses of that song that just absolutely put me off. I can't stand
That's
it.
funny. Yeah, well, it's just funny that you said it about Whitesnake. I saw Whitesnake. I was a lieutenant over in Germany, and we went to the Monsters of Rock tour. And Aerosmith, it was like a whole day, but just total side note, Whitesnake was a headliner. Aerosmith was the band right before Whitesnake, and Aerosmith destroyed them. And I just wondered what the conversation was backstage, because it was just like they were so much better.
So I wonder if it goes to what Ponch always teaches us, is that it goes to a state of flow. Like something like Whitesnake to me doesn't flow. Say like I'm a Grateful Dead guy. I love jazz. I love the Beatles. Like I don't feel like when I listen to something like that, maybe it's I don't get to the level of flow. And then as additionally to what we're talking about too, remember that John Boyd never published or printed anything.
Yes.
Because everything was constantly changing, constantly flowing. And his snowmobile of what he made OODA Loop Sketch out of was entropy, right? And
Yes.
then the other two would be uncertainty and incompleteness. Like, so when we go around with this desire to constantly measure everything, we got to constantly measure this, we got to constantly measure that. It's the same thing in war fighting. It's the same thing in business. It's the same thing in sports. Rigid measuring doesn't get you where you're going to need to be because things are constantly changing. And when they do, and you're stuck to those rigid formulas, then what? And even the Chinese officers are telling us like, hey, this is a good baseline and guideline. This is how the universe presents itself, but don't use it as a rigid formula. Just have it in mind as you scan and sense make of the world.
Moose, I'm going to riff off what you brought up here, and
Yeah.
I'm totally going to get this wrong. Okay, so going back to your Whitesnake point, I read this over the weekend that typically in music, we know when something is going to happen. We can anticipate it because music has patterns in it. What we don't know is what. So it is possible that you could anticipate something in the Whitesnake song, and that what isn't surprising to you. It doesn't satisfy you, right?
Yeah.
So there's great examples in a book I'm reading about music why we're attracted to different types of music. But the key point here is the patterns tell us when something is going to happen. They don't tell us what. Right. So maybe that's true with strategy. Just throwing that out there because I'm building on that Whitesnake piece.
Okay. So so we've written about on the Substack, there's an article about jazz and jazz was actually referred to in MCDP7 learning. Sarah and I were at a jazz club in New York last weekend, and they do, like when you listen to jazz, there's the bass line, there's the structure of the overall piece, and then each individual takes a ride, right? So the saxophone guy's going to go, then they're going to go through the whole progression, and then the trumpeter's going to go. They go through the whole progression, and the pianist, et cetera, et cetera. To Ponch's point, if you know the bass line, you can, if you know music well enough, you can sit there and be like, hey, I could go up there if I knew how to play it, but like I can think of notes in my head that fit these scales. So in other words, like something fits the scale, but I don't know exactly what, but I can anticipate. And if something is off, I'll know because it'll be out of sync, right? It'll be out of harmony, right? We talk about the difference between harmony and synchronization. It'll be out of harmony with what the scale or the structure or the rhythm pattern is, right?
Yeah.
So so it goes back to the whole thing. Like, well, why wouldn't strategy be any different?
So I want one more thing, and I'm sorry, this is amazing because over the weekend I listened to Ella Fitzgerald sing "Mac the Knife" from 1960s, where she got it wrong, but she knew everything about the structure of the song, and she even sang in the song that she's making a wreck out of it, right? But it got her, I think it got her an Emmy or whatever.
Yes.
So this type of thinking is if we understand the structure of something, we can improvise in it, right? And that's the whole point of warfare, I think, is if we have a sound structure that we allow those distributed warfighters to improvise. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Then you create the conditions to win a war.
You're right on.
Okay, Bill, can you build on any of this, man? We're just throwing things out there.
No, this is so if I know you guys have gone to my blog, and my blog, really the whole reason I did that, which I've been doing it for, it's like 15 years now, is I don't have a huge following. I mean, but it's because I was trying to figure things out. So there's a lot of pieces on there where I'm looking at a piece of music and trying to pick, like, okay, what did the artist mean when they said this? And then trying to lay it over leadership, strategy, innovation, or whatever. So everything you guys are saying, it's like, I'm just like, yeah, these are my people. So it's funny when you talked about, the idea of the methodology to the music, because Moose, you talked about the Grateful Dead, and I know there's that great piece on your, is it Substack or on the blog, but I went to it and was checking it out last week. The Dead are so interesting because they break those norms in so many different ways. But we love, yes, exactly. But we love the Dead. And then I ponder music today. And again, I sound like the old crusty, whatever, white beard guy. I got it. But the idea is like so much of music today is just so basic. And maybe that's because, to your point of if you know what's coming, it's like the warm blanket. You know what I mean? In other words, I can wrap myself in it because it's not really challenging me the way, honestly, so much of jazz challenges us when we listen to it, because you don't always know. But then you listen to it a few times and you're like Ella Fitzgerald in her version of Mac the Knife. Like, I love that version, but I can't remember the first time I heard it and it was wrong. You know what I mean? But now I hear it and it's right. So in other words, we adapt to the Grateful Dead. When I first listened to the Dead, I was very young, but I thought the Grateful Dead had to be a heavy metal band, because like Zeppelin and I listened to them, like, wait a minute.
They have names like Megadeth, and Guns N' Roses, Grateful Dead.
This isn't like metal. How did they get to be the Grateful Dead? Oh, well, it's a little bit of bluegrass. It's a little bit of jazz. It's a little bit of Eastern music and philosophy. I saw them years ago at Stanford, and they had 2 drummers. And I was like, well, how do you do that? I mean, so it was all these things that don't make sense that later do make sense.
Well, and they had no studio albums. Like, though they did, but that's not what people, that's not what people went after. They were totally in the flow state. That was the whole idea, to have like a core riff and then build flow around it. They made all of their stuff available. So if you came to a show, you could tape it and you could trade those tapes and you could bootleg those tapes. And the reason that they did that was so that the word spread, and their fan base ended up becoming their biggest marketing group. And it was decentralized. It was harmonized. It just seems to me like it's the John Boyd type of music for a lot of reasons. And it's extremely misunderstood because it's not produced. You know what I mean? It's not quote unquote measured and structured in what we're expecting from sort of the mainstream, that it actually kind of goes along with the rhythms of the universe. And the last thing I'll say is another John Boyd angle of it is it's interdisciplinary. So they had all different types of music. Yes. Phil Lesh was a classically trained composer. They wrote suites. They integrated music from every single genre, to your point about Eastern philosophy, which is, of course, is a big part of John Boyd's OODA loop sketch. And who used it? Like, Phil Jackson was a Deadhead, and he talked about how he built the Bulls, and he looked at Michael as like the Jerry Garcia, and constantly building an act around them that could bring them to a consistent state of flow as they encountered, and it was never the same. It was always changing, built around that same core.
So those loose ties, like Poncho's saying, that's when I think about strategy. That's kind of what I'm getting at, is how do you build those things around strategy? In other words, it's not do this, then do that. And I do think that so much, I hate to say that, doesn't sound right, but so much of what we think of today has to be, if I do this, then that will happen. And increasingly, that's not the case. If you do this, we don't know what will happen, but you need to get off your ass and do something. Don't sit there and be paralyzed by, what do I do? Do something and then react to the action.
So the strategy is adaptive. I mean, it's taking feedback from the environment and adjusting as necessary. Yes. So we go back to the 1999, look at where we are today with technology. And I think, what did they put in the Chinese put in that document as far as hacking? I forgot, they called it something other than.
Oh, they had a really good name. It was a crazy name. I wonder if I had it here.
But where
it was
I'm
an interesting name that they had for their
where
hackers.
I'm going with this is
but yeah, they totally called in the hacking.
Yeah. So there's a pattern to the strategy that looks more than likely aligns to the geometry or the golden ratio, the golden section. And then if you can set your strategy up such, then there's touch points where you can anticipate when something's going to change. It's the what that matters. How do you take that information from the environment and adjust at the local level? And that's what we're trying to tell folks with strategy. You can't have a rigid approach to warfare, right? And that's maybe what the Chinese are telling us with this document is we're going to be an adaptive approach to kicking your ass, while you guys are spending billions of dollars on aircraft carriers fighting the wars from 20, 30 years ago.
Do you find that, Bill, as you're interacting with officers today at every level, from flag officer, general officer, all the way down to, to brand new into the force, do you find that much of what they're being taught and much of what they're exploring personally, and I'm talking on the great average. I'm not talking about the outliers, say like us that are reading obscure things that no one's thinking about, like maybe Boyd would be, but do you find that what they're doing is it's more tech heavy, or it's more agenda driven top down, or do you find that it's kind of like the old days, like where generals that graduated from West Point in the 1910s and 20s and 30s, that these were well-rounded, not only engineers, but trained in liberal arts and languages and culture and other things to give them a broader understanding of how the world works? Where do you see us at right now?
So that's a really interesting question, because honestly, I've been fortunate where I've had some really, really amazing bosses. I mean, I think about people like, General Quast. General Quast is not your average general. He's a different level of thinker. General Duncan McNabb, I worked with him, same way, different level of thinker. Kip Self. I mean, these generals were definitely not your standard, like, this is what we do things. So I know that we have some amazing leaders. I mean, I look at, General Alvin, our CSAP, he and I were on the staff together a million years ago. So he is a deep, deep thinker. We've been lucky to have people like Brown and Goldfein and Welsh that I think they do think very different. But if you think about it from an org behavior perspective, what does our organization reward? It's not those thinkers like, Quast. And that's what I think is really interesting. Yet a guy like General Quast can raise up and be a 3-star, arguably, my opinion should have been a 4-star, but nobody called me and I didn't get to sit on that board. But, I look at people like that, General Alvin. I mean, so there's a way to get through this system and still have this out of the box thinking, but I don't think that's what the system rewards, especially if you look at, I think about I do a lot of work with SOS, and I see where our captains are, and they still haven't, a lot of them have not been assimilated yet, to the Borg. So they still have these crazy ways of thinking. And then if you go into ACSC, you see maybe fewer of those folks, and then probably War College, maybe a few less. There's that great book, you guys have probably read it, called Orbiting the Giant Hairball by Gordon MacKenzie. And one of the things he has in there is he talks about going into classrooms and saying, like in kindergarten, how many of you are artists? And every hand goes up. And you go back in like 4th or 5th grade, and maybe half the hands go up. You go back in high school, maybe 20%. So the idea is that we kill this idea of this innovative and creative thinking in especially the bureaucracy. So I think that the talent is there. And I think some of the people who have been assimilated can still do that thinking. But they also know they're in this organization doesn't necessarily reward that thinking. That makes sense?
It goes back to, you're right on. And it goes back to what our friend Don Vandergrift talks about all the time with Mission Command. Mission Command, the term has been completely perverted from what it was intended. And one of the things that Don calls for all the time is an overhaul of the personnel system, because, to your point, the personnel system does reward metrics, bureaucratic metrics, and the innovators and the thinkers likely get pushed out and they go into Wall Street or they go somewhere else because they don't want to deal with the machine anymore, so to speak. I think it does go back to the well-roundedness of leaders and thinkers. Now, I do say, and I'm biased as a Marine, I really do think that the Marine Corps always did a good job, at least when I was in, of getting us to read and think about things that weren't really a top-down. So we were reading Mao, and Mein Kampf was on the list, and Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein, and other science fiction books. It wasn't all just, hey, America's great, this is the way you do it, 1, 2, 3 always equals this, and that's how we do it. It was promoting fluid thinking, knowing that, as it says in warfighting, knowing that everything is chaotic, frenetic, constantly changing, that you have to have the ability to do that. And what Don always talks about, when we've done some staff rides with him and others, when you look at these great leaders of times past, I mean, these were not just engineers; these were also men of letters and culture. I mean, these were people that could speak multiple languages. These were people that could read philosophy. I'll never forget this as long as I live. So I was the second lieutenant at our field artillery school in Fort Sill, and the Marines were segregated away from the soldiers in the platoons. Like they broke us in platoons. Although we did have one strand of Army guys, and they were all like future 82nd guys or whatever that would be in our platoon. I guess they could PT with us. Anyway, I was reading a John Paul Sartre book, And an
Yes.
army officer called me out. Why would you read that? That has nothing to do with artillery. And I'm like, well, no, actually, it's philosophy, and we should be talking about these types of things. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like it's ridiculed and mocked. Like where it should be the other way around.
Yes.
We should be having these conversations about Chinese culture, Sun Tzu, the Golden Mean, jazz, music, Grateful Dead, Whitesnake, whatever it is.
And the thing about, you brought up this idea of reading and who's reading, but the thing is, it's not just a one read either. Like Sun Tzu, I can't tell you how many times I've read Sun Tzu or Lao Tzu, or like you mentioned Sartre. I mean, the idea of nausea, or when I was working on my doctorate, I really started reading a lot of existential philosophers because what I was looking at was existential. So how do we understand that except to go back to those philosophers that were wrestling with these ideas of what it means to be human?
Well, I want Ponch to chime in on this because this is something that boils our blood. So OODA loop is always reduced to a mechanical formulaic template that you can put on any situation. As long as you're faster than the other guy, you're going to win. And then OODA loop sketch as we know it, which came at the end of John Boyd's life. So Ponch and I have spent considerable hours and days inside of Boyd's archives, and books that he has there, thousands of them, cover every single category, and they're drowning in margin notes. What would you add, Ponch? What's your experience of learning from that, of what was input, what Boyd was inputting for himself to give us what he gave us before he died that's reduced?
Man, you got me thinking on this, and something else that Bill wrote about optimization and decision-making. So the OODA loop could reflect this ratio where tempo matters, right? We know that. There's connections to harmony. He writes about that all the time. So what I'm thinking now is the way you use the OODA loop is consistent with nature, which is we know that we actively engage with the external environment to solicit input and feedback to get sensory signals to tell us what's going on in the outside world. So it's constructed inside out, or top down, inside out. With that being said, I think what we're learning about today and what you and I have learned about the OODA loop is it's not the reductionist passive approach that many people use. In fact, the AI community is quickly finding out you can't scale linear OODA loops, the reductionist approach. What they are finding out is you can scale what John Boyd actually sketched out and gave us, which is an active inference approach, a Bayesian inference approach, a mathematical approach to dealing with uncertainty, right? So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I've actually got a question about the golden mean, golden section connection to economics that Bill came across, because I think it feeds into decision-making and optimization, which the OODA loop is about minimizing energy and maximizing, not control, but adaptation and learning in the environment. Sorry, Bill, I just kind of rambled there, but is there a connection to what you discovered with the economist that was studying the golden section?
I mean, that was interesting too, was to go in and see who actually has been using this. And there was an economist and a mathematician. And of course, I'm terrible with pronouncing Chinese names, but Lao Zhen, I believe is how to say that name. But Lao Zhen was looking at this idea of, from a mathematics perspective, how do I apply it to economics? So I do think it's one of those that we find in a lot of different places. And of course, then he got into actually taking that 0.618 and looking at it across markets, which that just blows my mind because it just hurts my head. But I tried to find a way to break it out in a Citadel way on the blog. And I still don't know that I got to the place where I can make total sense of it, except to say, this guy's much smarter than me.
Moose, did my answer, and what you just heard from Bill, is that, how does that resonate with you in the question you asked about Boyd's work?
Well, I think it goes right to the things that Bill points out in his article about strategic positioning, flexibility, adaptation, deception, misdirection, holistic thinking, patience, long-term planning, and lastly, leveraging strengths and weaknesses. I mean, that's right out of the John Boyd playbook, which is heavily Eastern influence. And this is lost on most that I think in our military establishment that focus on Western models, which are largely driven by bureaucracy. They're largely driven by metrics. They're largely driven by personal gain or an obsolete personnel system that is not enabling our orientation to deal with reality as it actually is. Now, I'm not saying that the Chinese officers are like spot on to what reality actually is, but at least it seems that they're trying to create and destroy and create models that are trying to help them align to it more than, say, your average American.
Here's another thought. You and I had folks on to talk about attractors, the adjacent possible and affordances in the external environment. If we look at music again, if you look at sacred geometry, these little attractors are out there, right? So maybe that's what we need to be looking at are the attractors, the affordances, the adjacent possible in the external environment, and looking for patterns there. And that informs our strategy. By the way we develop strategy is about looking outside in, right?
Yeah.
Not inside out.
Yeah, and that's why Boyd, then just take patterns of conflict. I mean, why does he start all the way back as far as he could go with recorded military history? Because his point was these concepts don't change; they don't go away. And what empowers an underdog to defeat non-underdog? I don't know what empowers David to defeat a Goliath is exactly this type of thinking. It's exactly this type of exposure to interdisciplinary ideas, understanding how things flow, understanding how patterns actually work, and why you study, why you make Marines read Mein Kampf and Mao and other things is so that they can identify these patterns, so that when they do happen, it's evident to me. It's part of my orientation, so that when I'm sense making and it occurs, I can see it faster than my opponents. And it's radical, it's decentralized. What Boyd talks about, what Marshall McLuhan talks about, being radical, decentralized, and pervasive in understanding media. And that, unfortunately, is not a popular way if you want to climb the ranks in a bureaucracy. Yet at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to win everything just because we have all the capital, all the tools, all the weaponry, all the sensors, all the guidance systems, all the missiles and rockets and bombs, et cetera. Because, as Boyd pointed out in Patterns of Conflict, using Andrew Krepinovich's book, The Army in Vietnam, as an example, we had everything and we lost to people with bicycles, AK-47s, and we killed more of them than they killed of us. We didn't win the moral war, and we didn't understand the cultural war there. And the places where we did, with like the Marine CAP program and the Green Beret A teams and things like that, we completely undermined all that in the name of open field showdowns, trying to lure the NVA into an open field showdown with force on force and go after terrain. And as we know, terrain does not win wars. Technology does not win wars. People do, and they use their minds. And that's what is lost, I think.
This is a very deep thinking episode where we're just throwing things out there, Bill. I mean, this topic, I don't have an answer. I don't think Mark has an answer. Have we triggered anything? What are you going through? What's going through in your mind right now? Are we crazy?
Yeah, so no, I'm totally with you. And I think that some of the things that Mark just brought up, it makes me think about if you get back to this idea of just basic Eastern philosophy, and you mentioned this idea of strengths and weaknesses, how do we look at these things? One thing that I've always been drawn to is this idea of yin yang. And I kind of break it down when I'm talking to students. I put it up there, and I always kind of make the joke that this is not something you get drunk and just get it tattooed on your butt. I mean, like, what does that symbol really mean? It's one, it's unity. It's also order, and it's chaos. So if you start thinking about order and chaos, what is the U.S. really trying to do so many times is to bring order to the chaos. But the chaos is always going to be there. The chaos isn't going to go away. So as we go into these fights, a lot of times, think about the war on terror. We were trying to bring order into a place like Afghanistan, which historically has always been chaos. Well, how did that go for us? Or back to your point, Mark, about Vietnam. I mean, we were trying to impose our will on a situation that we couldn't. That mean and that yin yang was still going to exist. So how do we exist in the chaos? Our bureaucracy is all about order. That's what we promote is order. Yet future conflicts, past conflicts, but let's just talk about the future, is going to be chaos. So how do we train and educate our leaders to understand the chaos and the order?
Let's isolate an example, since you brought up I say GWAT, but GWAT had, I have my GWAT medal, but let's use Afghanistan as an example. The paper One Tribe at a Time, written by James Gant, who was a major when he wrote it, and then he was forced out as a captain, special forces officer, that more or less cracked the culture code. If you read that paper, that was told by General Petraeus to, hey, read this and operationalize this. It was also found amongst Osama bin Laden's personal effects with a note that said, find this guy and kill him. because he figured out, like Lawrence did, how to harness culture, how to assimilate with culture and be a true liaison, how to bridge two worlds from a point of empathy, from a point of cultural understanding. And he actually had marked progress that could be measured, because violence went down, the influence of the enemy went down, just like it had with the CAP program in Vietnam, just like it had with the Special Forces A teams in Vietnam. That always is going to get pushed aside for something that's more, hey, this is what America does. It's Uncle Sam. We don't want any casualties. We're going to bomb you into the Stone Age, and you're just going to submit. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. And that's why we can't. It's why Afghanistan was a failure. It's why Vietnam was a failure, because that cultural aspect, I think, goes back to Boyd and Sun Tzu. It's tying in, can I connect with these individuals on the philosophical level, on the moral level? And if I can, I'm going to build a bond that cannot be disrupted by competing ideas, competing forces, or whatever. I'm going to build trust, be able to build mutual. We're going to have mutual trust. We're going to have intuition. We're going to be able to accomplish things together because we're able to connect on the moral plane. I used to tell clients this in my previous life in Wall Street asset management, was like, if you can build relationships with your clientele on the moral plane, on the philosophical plane, that bond is indisruptible. And you can't get underbid by a lower price. You can't get beaten by a competitor, because that bond that you have with that client, assuming that you're not a lawbreaker or anything like that, that bond is impenetrable. And I think that what we're talking about, what we started talking about why unrestricted warfare shocks so many people, or they don't even want to read it, is because it does great against what we're taught culturally from a bureaucratic complex versus a bottom up. This is how things work, and this is how we can assimilate and work together in a part of the world that's still, by and large, completely misunderstood by this part of the world. Now, I am going to punch in my horn, coming from the naval services. We've been intervening in the Far East since the 1830s. So I do think that the Navy and the Marine Corps does have some kind of edge, just my own personal theory, of understanding sort of Eastern ways, or being open to Eastern ways more than maybe the Army and the Air Force. We should be open to that, especially if they think that this is where adversaries are going to be. We should be learning why they think the way that they do, why they understand things the way that they do, so that we could hopefully get to a point where we don't have to fire a shot, which is also very, very Sun Tzu and very John Boyd.
Thought here, Chinese healing. You brought up yin and yang. I know there's some sacred geometry in that too. I don't have the document in front of me, but the way they look at healing in the East is not how we look at it here. Right. I mean, they're more into functional type approaches, whereas we're into siloed approaches in our healthcare system. So those experiences, that culture, if you will, triggers how they are oriented to the external world. We're not that way. So I'm just wondering, is there a connection to?
So I think it's a really interesting point, because you read Unrestricted Warfare, and it's a spectrum, right? That's why it's called Unrestricted Warfare. It's a new way of looking at warfare. In other words, and that translation's not a great translation of the title either. But let's just think about the United States. We talk about, and I don't care what acronym you use, I always go back to DIME because it's simple: diplomatic, information, military, economics. Over the last 30 years or so, we've really gotten to this giant lowercase d, lowercase I, giant lowercase e. To your point, Ponch, I think that's the stovepipe, right back to the healing. Like, we're gonna cure cancer. That's it. It's all about this cancer drug, or the military will solve all of our problems. And we know that's not true. You look at what China's doing right now with things like, just pick on Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, that's not necessarily military, although there's an M component in there. There's a D component, there's an I component, and there's an E component, all in that idea of a Belt and Road Initiative. So we can span the spectrum from the Eastern side. We're not doing that very well on the Western side. Arguably, I would say that we might have done a better job in the Cold War. The idea was that we had a pretty robust USAID, as an example. USAID aid is like, they're minuscule. I think that I worked with them a lot when I was in the Pentagon, and the quote was always something like, we have more band members in the DoD than they have members in USAID. But USAID is really important when you're trying to do things that are not military oriented, trying to make friends and influence people.
So there's a great picture of David Shoup, who was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Medal of Honor recipient, the Battle of Tarawa, reading the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which I think, to double check me, I'm pretty sure that's been on Service Chief reading list at some point. And what is it ultimately trying to do? It's trying to teach you how to become empathetic as a leader, to try to understand rather than just simply know. Anyway, back to your article though. What about the side principle rule? That's a concept that's talked about in chapter 6. I've seen other people write about that too. There's Quintus Curtius, who's a former Marine that does translation of military thinkers that we hope to have on the show at some point too. And he talks about, it was in the chapter 6, side principle, the side principle rule. And they spell principle not with LE, with an AL.
Yeah, and also the side element is another way of looking at that.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at it right now. But the idea is, I remember what they called the hackers now. They were called web rascals. But the idea was that there were these web rascals that would get into the system. And in a way, that's kind of the side element, right? It's how do I attack or do things on the side that's not a frontal assault? And we start think about China. I don't think, to your point, they don't want conflict over the Taiwanese Strait. They want it to be obvious. In other words, how do I win without firing a shot?
Yeah.
So when it becomes obvious, and just think about over the weekend, there's pictures released of their new, possibly 6th gen fighter. Like, hey, look at all the stuff we have. Fighting us is useless. We will win. Think about back to Ronald Reagan and Star Wars. The idea of Star Wars wasn't really a thing. You know what I mean? It was like, we didn't have the technology, but this idea that we could do this, and then knowing that America, if they say they're going to do it, is going to do it. I'm not saying it's what won the Cold War, but I'm just saying it was one thing on top of it, kind of a side principle or side element of how do we keep attacking this from the sides so we're not doing the frontal assault.
It amplified the adversary's friction. It got them thinking about things that they shouldn't necessarily be thinking about. It got them entertained with a sideshow, and they get distracted from focus. And I think that's what, when I take away and I think about unrestricted warfare, that's why I give TikTok a double take. And that's why I give a lot of the things that we see in media, a double take, because I think that the distractions are being put out there and we've lost then we wind up losing our focus.
So the principal side rule, is that kind of like the concept of obliquity? And I don't know if you ever read John Kay's book. I think it's about 15 years old now. It's the same thing in complex adaptive systems thinking, is you generally don't want to take things head on. You take an oblique approach.
Exactly right. How do you come at things from the side? We do some work with Michigan and a guy up there named Jeff DeGraff, and he always talks about the side door. Like, you need a side door into this. Like, how do you get in through the side, especially in bureaucracy? The idea of, just get a few generals on board. Okay, generals are really busy, and to get a general's attention is really hard. And just a little side note, I spend a lot of time working with generals. They don't like saying no either. So they get their henchmen to say no, which is usually their colonels, to go say no, or their captains, in your case, Ponch. But the idea of, like the general's like, that's a great idea. Then they look over at you and like, hey, go kill that. But so the side door is really, how do I come in it from the side? Maybe how do I go talk to the 06s before I talk to the general? Get the 06s on board. You know what I mean? And now you run a Kesselschlag maneuver. The idea of like you've got a cauldron around the individual and they don't even know it, that they're surrounded.
You just described what's happening now with the current war, right? I mean, people don't know that it's happening to them.
Yes, exactly right. It's the frog in the water.
Yeah.
Interesting you brought that up too, because I believe, and again, I have a terrible tendency to give the adversary too much credit. I learned this, Ponch, I know you were over in the Air Operations Center. I was too. There are so many times that I would look at things like, well, the enemy's going to do this, and they wouldn't do it. And I'm like, that was an obvious left hook. You could have got me right in the chin, and you didn't do it. So I do that often. But I look at China right now, and I do believe, Bill DeMarco only, they can hear us think. So they know what Americans do. Think about it. They're all in Hollywood right now. And it sounds so stupid. I wrote a piece on this too. Why are there no Chinese bad guys? Like back in the Cold War, there were Russian bad guys all the time. Red Dawn. Classic example, right? I mean, the first Red Dawn, not the second one.
I mean, you're describing the Gen X canon. Like,
yes, but the idea was the Soviets were the bad guys. And, movies and all these things. In other words, it was in our culture that you went to a blockbuster, the bad guys were Soviets. Today, the bad guys are who? Aliens, monsters. The idea is like, well, it's just everybody's okay. But it's not, just China already owns so much of a massive percentage of Hollywood that you can't do that. Red Dawn, the current version, I guess it's like 10 years, 20 years old now. But they wanted to be China. And China said no. So it became North Korea. So the fact is, we all know North Korea has no capability to launch an airborne assault in the United States of America. And their numbers are too small, blah, blah, blah. But the Chinese said no, so we said that's okay. Fentanyl drugs, TikTok, great example of social media. All these things that the Chinese are like, we'll just side door here. We'll just do this oblique movement here, here, and here. So they can hear us think. I'm sorry, Moose, I stepped on you.
No, it's interesting because I think back to World War II and you look at the movies that were produced before December 7th, 1941, like Abbott and Costello in the Army now about getting drafted, the Dictator with Charlie Chaplin. I mean, it feels like there was a lot of things that were programming us and preparing us for war in Europe. And then every movie that came out after, I always was very clear who the bad guys were, the Nazis and the Japanese. I mean, that was every single movie we ever grew up with. And to
even
your point,
Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. I mean, that was like even the cartoons had the same
the propaganda.
thing.
Yeah, I mean that's really it is really fascinating to think about. But it goes. I think that people understood that the war is also in the mind. It's just not against the terrain or against people we don't like. If in those cases Germans or Japanese in those days, but that we have to be conditioned to think that first, because in our country, as we all know, before December 7th, 1941, there was a lot of Japanese people that were Americans and a lot of Germans that were Americans that were living amongst us and a vibrant part of our culture, just like China. Chinese have been in the United States since the 1800s, from the very beginning. And then when you read books about James Bradley that wrote Flags of Our Fathers and the Flyboys about the Ai Shima raid, he has been taken off the good list because he wrote a book called The China Mirage. And he goes back and he documents a lot of these things that over the last 100 or so years that China really has a burr in their side that the Western world between the United Kingdom and the United States has caused for them, like the opium wars and pushing opium and selling opium into China and taking Macau and Hong Kong and stuff. And what we forget, and this is about the cultural differences, right back to that, they're thinking back thousands of years, like 100 years to them is like, but like, think about us. We think like 24 hours ago, like people are already not talking about how quick did Donald Trump getting shot came right out of the news cycle, right? Like we don't even think in terms of that because we're so attuned in the West to this 24-hour news cycle, whereas their minds and their thinking is going back, thousands and thousands of years in some cases, such that where the golden ratio comes from, right? I mean, that's not a new concept.
No, it's an ancient concept. Yes.
Yeah. We talk about psychedelic therapies all the time. That's not a new thing. Like those are thousands of years old. It's new to us because I didn't see it on CNN in the last 24 hours. But
more and more it's on CNN.
Yeah. Recency bias is a massive problem, but it goes back to the loop sketch. I mean, if I understand my opponent's biases, I'm able to leverage those to my advantage. I'm able to amplify their friction. And to your point, Bill, we broadcast our biases religiously. Like it's everywhere.
You do it on social media everywhere. So that's it. The capturing of the external environment by the Chinese informs their strategy. That's it. Right. I mean, we don't think like that.
We've all lived on bases overseas, right? Me, not only as an officer, but also as a kid. And you step on Grafenwehr Army Training Area in 1983. You leave Germany, you leave Bavaria, and you go into America. It's got the PX, it's got American cars, it's got everything. It's like everywhere we go, we put America. And I remember reading about Jim Gant in the book American Spartan, was written by his wife, Ann Tyson. They're talking about how whoever relieved them or replaced them, like the first question when they would get to these villages that he had been so successful with, the first thing out of their mouth, well, where's the chow hall? Where's the weight room? Where's the PX? Where's all this stuff that we're so accustomed to versus what was culturally attuned to success, understanding how things operate elsewhere.
So then I always have to wonder, how to fix it, because then you realize that we're not going to get rid of, the idea of social media. That's not going away.
No.
So what do we do? How do you counteract it? And the problem is, as a capitalist entity, you think about, let's go back to Hollywood. It's all about the money. There was some interesting work done, speaking of philosophy and all this, you guys probably have read some of the stuff from the Frankfurt School, but there was this whole bit about how do you make art in a capitalist society? Because the fact is, you'll keep making the art that makes the money. And again, I love capitalism. Capitalism is a great thing. But the fact was, if you keep making art to make money, you'll keep making the same things over and over again. So then I look at superhero movies, just an example. They were great. Think back to 1989 Batman. That was just Michael Keaton and Batman. Amazing. And then all of a sudden, well, that made a lot of money.
Still the best.
Yeah.
Jack Nicholson, the Joker.
Yes, we got to keep on making that movie over and over again.
Mayor of Gotham. I mean, that was the best. Kim Basinger. Come on.
Yes, it's a great movie. But we keep on trying to remake. Then Marvel comes out. The first Marvel movies are really great. When's the last good Marvel movie?
Bill, how many movies have been made about TV shows that we grew up with? There's a Chips movie and a Dukes of Hazzard movie and a Charlie's Angels movies and things like that. It's like, find something original. Like, what do we
keep on remaking it because that's where the money is, although arguably not. But it's a safer bet than making something new. So the Frankfurt School is saying the same thing with art. The fact is that basically art will continue to only be made based on what we know we like. That worries me a bit. And this is a way tangent, but since we talked about music earlier, it worries me with the algorithms now and like Apple Music, because what it's doing is feeding me the music it knows I like, but I'm the guy that likes music I don't know that I like, if that makes any sense.
Well, now you've done it. Now you've opened another thing that we've talked a lot about, Marshall McLuhan. So Marshall McLuhan thought that the artists were actually the do line. If you remember the defense early warning system, artists are actually the do line of what's coming. So if you're able to pull out away and strip out away the sort of the money-making art that you're talking about, and you're actually looking at like the art for art's sake, the actual legitimate artist, that's the do line that's telling us what's coming. And that's what's actually leading the turn that are coming. Huh. Hey, Ponch, I don't know about you. I smell a live broadcast with Bill, John Robb, and Andrew McLuhan.
Yeah. So I don't have a lot of answers right now. We've got a lot more research to do, more conversations to have. Looks like we'll get Alan Green on the podcast and maybe a live conversation. Bill, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Alan Green, but he was a producer years ago and then does a lot of work in sacred geometry. Very, very familiar with Shakespeare. And he actually had a series that I watched called the America Codes, where he decoded the Declaration of Independence, what's in there and all that. It's kind of interesting. Connecting back to Tao and Phi again, there's a lot of connections in there to what we talked about. But we're pretty early in our exploration of this topic, and we've come across it again in physics from Adrian Bijan and his work on the physics of flow and beauty and time. It's in the back half of some of his books. We've come across it in music. We're definitely come across it in the world of psychedelic assisted therapy. And some work on Wall Street with Mandelbrot, connections to Mandelbrot. In fact, Mark and I pointed out that John Boyd was starting to explore a little bit of Mandelbrot's work before he passed. And then, of course, we're looking at sacred geometry applied to the planets, the universe, and understanding the connection to the pyramids. What do the pyramids really mean? Finding more connections back to the pineal gland, back in the sarcophagus of the pyramid. So there's so many unknowns right now. And I think what we definitely want to do is have you back and continue this conversation as we explore with experts in the field of sacred geometry what this means. Because I do believe, like you do, I think you do, there's a solid connection to strategy or decision making.
Yeah, and I think Moose brought it up, the idea that it has to be fluid and agile. Because when we're looking for the absolute answer, it's probably not there. In other words, it's not going to be full every time you put these two things together. But if we don't have a basis to build off of, then we've got nothing. And I kind of feel like right now we're taking a lot of shots in the dark when it comes to national level strategy, and we don't really know what it is. So that we're not basing on anything. We're like, Chinese, they're bad. So therefore the strategy should be, we'll kick your ass. Well, I don't know if that's a good strategy, because do you really want to go toe to toe? Do you really want, I don't think anybody wants that. But you have to deter also, which means you have to spend money on defense. So it's like, I don't know. It's just one of those that I agree with you. And obviously I'm very early on in these thoughts as well. I'm throwing spaghetti at a wall, hoping to see what sticks.
Are you familiar with SACO? SACO is from, it's the Sino-American Cooperation Organization. It's also, the nickname was the Rice Paddy Navy. And it was commanded by a U.S. admiral named Milton Miles. His call sign was Mary, because I guess there was a famous actress, Mary Miles. So it's Milton Mary Miles. In his book, which I challenge you to find it, I actually have a copy and I paid a lot of money for it. It's called A Different Kind of War. And how I heard about this was General Gray, who we lost last year, who was a collaborator with John Boyd and was the force behind warfighting. the MCDP-1 warfighting, said he was talking about one of his predecessors, Robert Barrow, that had won the Navy Cross at the Chosin Reservoir and then the Distinguished Service Cross in Dewey Canyon in Vietnam. But he talked about how General Barrow, when he was fighting in World War II, General Barrow was not on the islands. He wasn't in Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, any of them. General Barrow was in the Rice Paddy Navy under Admiral Milton Miles, and what they were doing was basically creating a guerrilla force inside of China to counteract the Japanese domestically in China. And basically, it came down to sort of two rival arguments. One was the Chinese nationalist argument, and the other one was the communist argument. And then I guess the Americans were kind of split on that. So Milton Miles had a one view, one way. And Donovan, who was the first CIA director, I think, or like he was at OSS at the time, he had a different view. And that split, in his assessment, was what was causing all the problems with China after World War II, like, how Mao came to power and things like that. But the point of it is that we actually do have a history. We do have a lineage of these things, like SECO, the CAP program. We do have a history of these types of things that are aligning with cultures and making massive outsized outcomes with very small differentiated inputs.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up too, because I ponder things and similar but very different. Things like Radio Free Europe. Like our culture, the American culture is extremely powerful, very powerful. And I don't know, I haven't read, maybe I have. I imagine the Chinese are afraid of our culture, which is why they're attacking our culture. And I don't mean that in a weird way, because they're not necessarily, it's a side door, right? It's Hollywood, it's music, it's this, it's that.
You're not wrong. Yeah. James Bradley talks about in the China Mirage how the Mandarins and the Emperor of China, I mean, we were referred to, it would say we, meaning Westerners, Anglo-Saxon Westerners from the United States and the United Kingdom, they were called barbarians, and they were restricted. They were restricted of movement. They weren't allowed to leave the areas, what became Hong Kong, what became Macau. They weren't allowed to leave those areas. Like, they had to be restricted. They could only do business certified with all approved. And we were, again, I did say we, but, Westerners that were intervening in China have always been referred to as barbarians.
Yes. Yeah.
That's who was at the gate that overturned Rome, right? I mean, that's I guess that's the understanding maybe of sort of the Eurocentric lineages were barbarian hordes, I guess. I don't know.
Bill, is it possible that, I only use a term here that I don't like that much, but center of gravity is culture? Is it possible?
I think for the Chinese, it is something that they feel is a center of gravity, maybe not the center. Of course, we can argue if there's multiple or one centers of gravity. But I do think that the culture for the Chinese is a center of gravity. But to the point of this whole conversation, that's a very loose center of gravity. In other words, what do the metrics look like to attack somebody's culture? In the West, we'd want to know, have we degraded the culture by 6.2%, or is it 8.9%, or is it, the Chinese don't care. I don't believe. I think they just know, if I can buy enough studios in Hollywood, if I can influence music, if I can get into social media, I am making a difference in their culture.
So the world of complex adaptive systems thinking says that you just amplify the behaviors you want and dampen the ones you don't. It's really simple. You don't measure it. You just keep going in a direction of travel. We struggle with this with our leaders, right? They're challenged with this type of thinking. So when you brought that up, I'm thinking, if you're going to attack us, you break our culture. You leverage the internet, create tribalism, amplify that. Make us hate each other. Democrats hate Republicans. Republicans hate Democrats. So this is the idea of Boyd's Italy too, is to fool this upon ourselves. Right? And I don't know, Mark, man. When you're talking about that, so this is it. This is the war that we're fighting.
It goes back to what Sean Ring was talking about the other day when we were live on X. That when you think of, we talk about the 24-hour news cycle, right? A 4-year presidential term is not that much longer than a 24-hour news cycle in the scope of things.
4 years is nothing. It's not.
And a 2-year congressional term and a 6-year senatorial term, and even a 2-term president at 8 years, in the grand scope of things, we're constantly on this, like, got to get things done quick. So we don't have the ability, just I think by design of our system with representative democracy, we don't have the ability to take a long view. And I'm not advocating a system. I think that our system of a representative republic as we were founded, I think is naturally biased. I swore an oath to defend that, as you did too. the one thing about it, and it seems to get worse and worse, is that we're not able to take the things that you talk about in your article. We're not able to take a long-term, holistic view because there's so many competing interests in the short run of people that want to get satiated by money, by fame, by promotion, whatever. It really does put us at a massive disadvantage and vulnerability from that respect.
So I agree 100%. The fact is that not saying we alter our system at all. Yet you talk about the long term. We took a long-term approach when you think about things like containment, long telegram, all this stuff is like we were able to rally around something like, the Soviet Union and communism and say, that's bad. And it lasted for several generations. How do we do that? Now, and you could look back at Truman and Eisenhower, interesting time for the United States. Eisenhower inherited this massive debt from Truman because we were plussing up everything we could to fight the Soviets. And Eisenhower knew that's not sustainable. NSC 68, these other things that all came from that era. The fact was, or even the Solarium project, these things that happened under Eisenhower's watch that we could easily replicate today if we could get past the partisanship. And then to argue, is our partisanship exacerbated by Russia and China? Again, I don't want to sound like I'm a conspiracy theorist or anything else, but we have to admit it's a possibility.
No, I think it goes back to cultural understanding, though. So here's a name for you: Lieutenant Colonel Pete Ellis. Earl Ellis was his name, Pete Ellis. And he had been over in the Far East. He was a Marine officer, and he had come back and basically predicted everything that was going to happen in the Far East for no other reason other than understanding them and going over there and saying that we are going to have to go back over there in 20 years and take these islands back from the Japanese because of how they're, after the 1919 Paris Agreement, how they're just taking all these German possessions, how it's just going to keep pushing down on us, taking things from us, right? Like Guam and the Philippines and other things. I think too, we got to look at like a guy like MacArthur. I mean, love or hate MacArthur, MacArthur had his finger on the pulse of the Far East for most of his entire life, with the exception of World War I, his time at West Point, his time as Chief of Staff of the Army. Almost all of his career was spent over in the Far East, and he had a much different understanding. And I think a lot of the success in Japan after the war is because there was an overseer like MacArthur that did have an understanding of the culture, that was able to recognize the value of things that we've talked about, Ponch, with Charlie Protzman, that if we mix these cultures and they can understand each other, we can get a much better outcome than saying one's better than the other and we're going to force that one out. We're going to make you do this.
All right, let's build on that. So Protzman, a Shingo Prize-winning author, talks about the origins of lean, the Toyota production system, and other things. So what did it take? It took Japanese to come over here and look at what we're doing, to see the world from their perspective and take it back, right? Whereas we couldn't do that that well. So you can't change the system from within. You have to go outside the system, correct, Mark? Okay.
Yeah, and the more that you try to do it, the more confusion and disorder increases, per John Boyd. That's the whole point of disruption creation. That the more I try to fix the system within itself with all the views within the system, that's where I get the incestuous amplification of confusion and disorder. And if I could get my opponent to do that more and more and more and more, irrelevance, obsolescence, and ultimately extinction, that's what has to happen.
That's a lower energy approach to warfare right there. You just, yeah. Okay.
Right. But to piggyback on that too, think about George Kennan. He wasn't here. He was in Moscow. So he was outside he's part of the system. I got it. But outside the system, learning about what was going on and what did he see in Russia? I don't know how that happened. But how do you learn about the adversary? He's sitting in Moscow making notes and saying, hey guys, I think we got a bigger problem than what we realize.
Oh yeah. What's the book? What was his name? William Shirer, who was in Berlin, and he was writing about all these things that were going on in Germany, and nobody listened. Like, nobody listened, and bam, Hitler comes, and he was writing about that. I think he was like the New York Times correspondent in Berlin, and he was sending these dispatches. I think it's like The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich was his book. But he had been saying for years as the correspondent all these things that were happening, and everybody's like, no, Hitler's good. He's bringing order. He's the Time Magazine Man of the Year. Little did we know. But he challenged assumptions, right? I mean, and that's always
Yep.
Which again, I think that's the value of what it is. Like, just to say that article that you put out about decoding asymmetry, about the Chinese using the golden ratio as a starting point. And then you say, as they say, that there is a fuzziness to it, though. It's not exact. Yes. There's a fuzziness to it. And that's the other thing that people in the West don't understand. They're always looking for exact, correct, this is it, and they're not allowing for the things that Boyd talked about, entropy, uncertainty, and incompleteness, that's always going to be fuzzy, fluid, in a constant state of motion.
Yes, and in fact, the authors even mentioned that, like you said, Unrestricted Warfare, that it's fuzzy and it's fluid.
Wow.
That was fun. That was one of the more challenging episodes because we're just riffing off each other there. And that's what we want from this.
Which is jazz. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean everything we put out there is gospel. It's just like, hey, we're thinking about this live. And I mean, there's a lot more to be discussed as we reflect on this. So, Bill, I really appreciate you coming on today, man. It's been really, really, really fun conversation.
Yeah. And you have to come back.
Oh, I'd love to. And I get it, because at the end, I feel like we didn't solve anything. We just muddied the waters probably more, but sometimes it's good to have those conversations.
I think it goes back. One of our guests that we're putting out soon, Sam Alimo, was talking about the importance of the study of philosophy. And one of the things he was talking about Socrates.
Amen. Yes.
Yeah. The more that we ask and the more that we question, the more we realize that I don't know, and people don't like the Socratic way of thinking, but that's important to keep asking as if you don't know, because I think, as Boyd said, he reviled the term expert. If you called him an expert, he absolutely reviled. He said that is not what I am. It's a know-it-all. And the other thing he hated to be called was an analyst, because an analyst means that I can break things down, but I can't put things back together as a synthesis. And he said the worst thing you could say on top of those things would be an analytical expert. So we don't want to be those. We want to be, I think maybe this goes back to really what we were talking about earlier. Officers should be scholars, and they should be in a constant state of learning. And they should not be limited into what it is that they're learning and questioning, because if they're pursuing things that can help enlighten reality, they shouldn't be written off as a quack, like Pete Ellis was written off as a quack, and Patton and others, that were doing radical thinking. That should be encouraged, not discouraged.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's interesting. The book or the movie, We Were Soldiers, when Hal Moore is, in the movie, it shows him in his barracks or in his on-base house doing all this studying and this reading. I always thought that was so interesting, because I don't know that we do that anymore. He was getting this mission that he had to go over to Vietnam, and what was the helicopter going to do or not do? And, there's that scene where he's in his house on base and he's reviewing all these books and he's trying to get smart. And for me, that always stuck in my head, because Hal Moore actually came and spoke at SOS when I was a student a million years ago, before the movie came out. And I remember just thinking, oh my word, this guy he's amazing.
So there's a classic example of what old West Point used to be able to do, and take a young man like Hal Moore from Bardstown, Kentucky, and turn him into a Harvard level scholar, interdisciplinary thinker that's able to combine philosophy, technology, strategy, able to fuse all that together to be successful in his own right. Ask people, hey, have you read Street Without Joy by Bernard Fall? Like, who's Bernard Fall? What's that about?
There's this idea, I think, that some of our officers, not all of them, because this is a problem, the bureaucracy wants one size to fit all. In other words, we're widgets, because the idea is when one widget fails, everybody moves up one.
That's the personnel system.
There's a lot of talk about, redoing it, all this. I don't know. We'll see if it happens. But the idea of a polymath, like, we need polymaths in the military, and I just don't know that we reward it. Yes, exactly right. Yes. It has to be. You don't want everybody to do that. Just like you don't want, like, innovation where I live. You don't want everybody to be an innovator. It'd be absolutely a shit show. But you need to find those folks who do it well and reward.
Yeah. Yeah. It needs to be encouraged, not discouraged.
Yes.
And when so, well, let's pause there then, and we will continue. Tell everybody your website, so we can, we want people to go to your website and read the article, Decoding Asymmetry.
Yeah. It's
Decoding Asymmetric Doctrine, Revisiting Unrestricted Warfare, the Golden Section, and and China's Quest for Victory.
It's M100 Group is .com, M100, the number 100 group.com. Or if you just look up Google Mastermind Century Group, you'll find it.
Now, are you on X, or have you?
No, I am, but my presence is not It's just not
Okay.
huge, but I am on X.
Okay. Well, if you want to go live with us, we need you on X. So
Sure, I can do
we'll,
that. No problem. I'd love to do that.
thanks for coming on and sharing time with two naval officers, a Marine and a naval aviator.
Yeah.
It's the beauty of jointness. It's what it's
Thank
supposed to
you.
do.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.